All right. What's up? What's up? What's up? So happy to be here today. For everybody that's joining us, my name is Donte Milligan. I'm a theologian, a minister, a bourbon enthusiast, Philly sports fan, an educator, and just genuinely a person that likes to have good conversations. And I'm here with my friend Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy McMinn. I am similar to Dante, an educator, but we are also very different people. I'm from North Carolina, just recently moved up to the Philly area about 2 years ago. I've lived around the world. I love traveling, lived in the Middle East, in Latin America, and yeah, excited to have some good conversations.
Yeah, so we put this together. I know this is our first episode. We put this together. I love talking about the Bible. I love studying the Bible, and I love thinking about God and the divine. And I like thinking outside the box and thinking about ways that maybe we get bogged down. And I know that there's a lot of questions out there, and sometimes trying to ask a question, you're in an environment that's super stuffy, and people are stuck up and they don't want to really answer your questions, or they get offended easily. That's not this environment. We got some bourbon. We're tapping into my southern roots and her southern roots. We're gonna have a light drink. And I gave Amy a little homework assignment that she read, and she's gonna ask some questions, and we're just gonna see where this conversation goes. And that's what it is. So we are. Do you want to add anything before I say the verse and
I guess,
everything?
well, the only thing I will add is that I have, while Dante has this theologian
Yes.
background,
Yes.
I do not. So I grew up in the Episcopalian church. So,
Right.
I'm familiar with a lot of the stories. I've never really sat down and read the Bible through. I mentioned I had traveled abroad. I lived in Jerusalem for 2 years,
Mm-hmm.
and I started teaching there actually, which was a whirlwind of an experience, but was the time when I started to reflect of like, oh, I would actually like to know what this book says and
Mm-hmm.
to understand the context I was living in, but also understand how it can apply to everyone else. So I have a lot of questions. I'm kind of critical when it comes to some of this. And yeah, you can take away our starting
Yeah.
story.
And actually, I'm glad you put that background in. And yes, we do a very different background in that sense. I grew up in the church, never really left the church, went to a lot of different churches, but have always been drawn to, called to, pulled to, just understanding the text deeply and differently, and seeing all the ways that different faith groups and people see the text. And I try to be pretty open minded and easy to talk to about it. So we thought we'd be a good pair to talk. So today's episode, we're going to start off right in the beginning. So right there in the creation story or stories. Hint, hint. So we're going from Genesis 1 through Genesis 3, and looking at the traditional creation stories. And so I gave this to Amy. She's got an old King James Bible, an old classic that she read already, and she's just gonna hit me with questions, and we're gonna talk. And the plan is to kind of keep doing this. So as we keep having episodes, we're gonna go through this first couple of episodes, what we call the primordial myths or the primordial stories. So some of the big hits: Cain and Abel, the flood, the Tower of Babel, Sodom and Gomorrah, right? These are all in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. We're going to hit all of those stories, but today we're going to start literally in the beginning. But before we do that, let's have a sip of some trusty Tennessee bourbon that I got from down in
Down from
Tennessee,
my neck of the
down
woods.
from your neck of the woods. So I'll pour a little for myself. And if you would hand me you can see we got real fancy for y'all. You know what I mean? We got the good glassware right here.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Ching ching.
All right. So before we dive in and get all biblical, I haven't seen you all summer.
It has been a while. It has been a while.
How's your summer been?
It's been good. I mentioned I'm from North Carolina for those of y'all. I still got the y'all going,
For
even
you
though
said
I'm up here.
I'm not gonna lie. I thought that was intentional for a second.
It comes out. It does come out whenever
the
after I've
the
been there
bourbon
for a
makes the
while.
draw a little bit more.
It actually does. A couple more of these.
Yeah.
You don't know what'll come out. Yeah, it is good. I have a lot of family at home. Yeah, a lot of family. All my friends are down there, but it's good to see family. It's also good to get back up into my space. And yeah, I took my dog hiking some.
Nice.
I'm from Asheville. We have a lot of good beer. So lots of good breweries.
We got to do a beer episode one of these days.
Yeah, Bible stories and beer.
Bible stories and beer. It works with everything.
But yeah, it was a pretty good time. And I know you've been working.
Yeah, don't remind me. I've been working. She's like she said, we're both in education, but I unfortunately am an administrator now, so that means I have to work 12 months out of the year.
To my benefit, though, we love having Donte and Amy.
Thank you. Far too kind. But I did get a chance to go to her neck of the woods. I have two small children. And if anyone's ever tried to take small children to the beach, you know that sucks. So we were like, let's go to the mountains. So we went out to the beautiful Smoky Mountains. And I don't know if you've ever heard this. You're on TikTok, right?
Of course.
So there's
I teach high school.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even know why I asked it. There's like a sound, and it's Steve Harvey. And he's talking about the Smoky Mountains, and he literally he's like, you want to see something, Steve Harvey, you want to see something beautiful that God did? You don't believe in God, you take somebody down to them Smoky Mountains down there. Let me tell you something, you going to believe in God, you go see them Smoky Mountains. And it's so, and like people just put it over like shots of the mountains. But I'll tell you, man, like we went up to Anakista, we got pretty high up there. I'll show you some pictures. But like, I mean, it's sacred, man. There's something about being that small.
It's a beautiful, and I feel so grateful to have grown up there, honestly. Mm-hmm. Like, the first time that I lived away from the mountains, it was a culture shock for me.
Yeah.
And, like, I was just so used to, like, having that nature and that beauty around all of the time. But there's another thing, too, like, when you're driving in and you see that first mountain, and it's like you know you're home, or you know you're getting close. And
it's different. I mean, we got the Poconos out here. My wife is from the Poconos, so I was messing with her the whole time. Like, this ain't the Poconos. Poconos ain't got mountains like this. But I mean, it's different. We don't have anything like that, and that's not even the biggie. That's not even the Rockies. Like, we're not even in the biggest mountains in the country. But I mean, it was something to see. So we'll probably be taking some more trips down there in the near future. But speaking of things that were created.
We can get to the creation.
Yeah.
And
you heard that?
And it's interesting too. So, and even talking about the Smoky Mountains, I think is another good transition into this version of the Bible that I am reading.
Yes. Talk about the version.
So, this copy of the Bible that I have is from my father, who passed away about 5 years ago. And he actually gave me this Bible in the last conversation that I ever had with him. I had just accepted this job in Jerusalem, and I knew he would take it horribly. He didn't like it when I went to safe places. He hated when I traveled around Europe, and like Jerusalem, like, yeah, he has reason to be upset.
A little less than safe at times, yeah.
And he had no words when I told him that I took this job. Like, I didn't even tell him I was applying, or when I interviewed, I waited until I got the job. And I told him, like, I'm moving to Jerusalem in 2 weeks. He doesn't say a word. He gets up, picks up the Bible from his bookshelf, and says, "Guess it's about time you read this." But this was given to him from his sister. My father was one of 11 children. And he grew up in an old one-room schoolhouse, like very Appalachian culture, very similar to our girl Dolly right here.
I was going to say, I got to see Dolly's house when I was in Dollywood.
So like the upbringings are actually very similar, and it's very, like, he grew up in a level of poverty that I think it's hard for people to understand today.
Even in like a urban place like Philly, what we see as poverty is not... you still had floors, like, you're not sleeping on dirt. You know what I mean?
He didn't have running water until after he moved out of his house. He moved out when he was 12 to go live with sisters. But they didn't have running water. They didn't have floors until he left. And that's kind of the background of his family and religion. They were very Southern Baptist,
right.
Which I do think is very different than, your background. But I am already seeing that through... initially reading this. So, I go to open this Bible. I will say it actually took a lot of energy for me to like sit down and start reading.
Yeah.
I've been excited about doing this, but when it came down to like actually sit down, I had so many mental blocks of like sitting down and just reading it.
Yeah.
But like page 1, it says like a note intended to be read. so I did. I read it.
They're telling you what to do.
And it's like, okay, like to read, I will read this. And in this background, it does, give the context of like, how do you read this Bible? Because there are 1,700 types of footnotes.
Right.
I'm a history teacher. I love footnotes, but this is like another level and another whole system. And since I am trying to be like thorough with this reading, like, okay, I should know how to do this. But it's a lot. It's been a lot. But I wrote a little summary of our first 2 chapters, which are the focus for today. So, the creation. God has a busy 6 days creating everything. He makes heaven and earth, light and dark, the ocean, the lands, the animals, and finally, man. God decides they are good, and he deserves a day of rest. God then makes the most amazing garden for man, aka Adam, including the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Yes.
The only rule is don't take from the tree. Then God realized Adam might be lonely. So he put him to sleep, stole his rib, and made Eve. They were naked and were not ashamed. That's my summary of chapters 1 and 2.
Okay.
And there's a lot there. Like it's I know where we're going with this story. So we know this is the foundation for shit to hit the fan.
Right.
But so far, it's nice, but it is still there's still a lot here.
Yeah.
Even within 2 chapters.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure where to start with.
I was
going
to say, was there anything that like stood out, threw you off, that was a little like odd?
So going through my notes, well, it actually was more of the footnotes that were throwing me off or that were bringing up questions for me.
Okay.
So one of the first things that, well, let me see, going through my notes here. Okay, so this is a new concept for me. Dispensation.
Oh, God. The footnotes go into dispensation?
Literally on, like, in these first 2 chapters.
Whoa. I didn't see that coming. All right.
So, I think I generally understand the concept. So, like, as a history teacher, when I'm reading about this concept, it reminds me of this idea of, like, periodization. Of, like, we identify different times of history that can sort of fall into years, but sort of don't fall into years, but encompass themes that are like something significant or some kind of change is happening. Yeah. And so this idea reminds me of that. Yes. Is that generally?
Yeah, but so dispensationalism or dispensationism, I'll figure out if I said that right or not, is essentially that there's this belief that there were 7 dispensations or 7 periods of time, and it's an attempt to sort of connect the Bible and essentially make it univocal. So something that people will notice when they read the Bible is that the Bible seems to talk in different voices, and it seems to contradict. And many scholars would say, well, the reason it seems to contradict is because it absolutely does contradict. But if your worldview is based on the Bible being the perfect word of God, and everything is literal, you can't have things contradicting. So you want it to be one voice. So part of dispensationalism is to say, well, at this time, things were like this, and then at this time, this is what's going to happen, and then this foreshadows this, and this foreshadows that. What's interesting is, and I'll have to fact check myself, but dispensationalism doesn't become a thing, I want to say, until like the early 20th century, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, that's about when the book was published.
Yes.
That was literally like one of my first notes in here was like, he's like, well, within the past 50 years, there's been a revitalization of this kinds of interest.
Exactly. And that's something that people have to understand about biblical study and biblical scholarship. And people often want it to be simpler than it is. But like a lot of these things are created later on, and then we go back to the scriptures and we go, I think I see this thing here, I think I see this thing there. And that's not a statement to say that like dispensationalism is false or it's wrong or anything like that. I'm not really in the business of like telling people what to believe, but at least understand that that was created by a set of theologians, a set of conservative theologians that had an idea, and then they applied that to the scriptures.
Would you say that that's like a widespread a widespread interpretation of Christianity, that they believe in this?
No.
Okay.
And that's a surprising thing. So like I grew up, like I went to like a Christian school from like grades like 1 to 8, and it was in the Presbyterian tradition, the conservative Presbyterian Church USA, I think, is the conservative branch, and they would be, that's big like in the vein of John Calvin, and they're
Okay.
really big on things like that, very literal interpretation of scripture. So like that 6 days for them, that's 6 days. The world was created in 6 days.
Well,
That's
yeah.
actually not the majority view, and I didn't know that until like I don't know, a few years ago, that that if you go to the doctrines of the Lutheran Church or the Episcopal Church or even the Catholic Church, that they don't take that literally, and that if you go back into the interpretation of Genesis all the way back through Jewish Midrash and Talmudic discussions, it's never been taken literally. That is something that was created later, and a lot of that goes back to the Protestant Reformation, because in your history teacher, so you know this, the Protestant Reformation is happening roughly at the same time as the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution. So what's everybody looking for if you make a claim during this time? You got to have evidence.
You gotta
You
have
got to have
evidence.
proof. So for Christians, it becomes, well, the Bible is now our proof. And so there's a different lens that's added to the Bible that didn't need to be there before, because people weren't using the Bible to prove historical or scientific facts.
That's good. This is good context. This is helpful context, because that was literally one of the questions I had when I was reading this. Like, I can tell that this version has an agenda.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
yeah,
I
for
could
sure.
tell pretty clearly, and you know, I'm taking all of the footnotes in kind of with that context. It's also kind of interesting for me though.
Yeah.
To see, because they are clearly making a very literal interpretation.
Yeah, yeah, and it's
But when it's even more literal, it does make some things even more silly
yeah
to an extent.
Yeah.
Of like, so, and this is, you know, probably not like the biggest of questions, but so chapter 1, this is basically like day by day this happens. Like that's all fine and dandy. Like honestly, I don't really have any problems with chapter 1.
Right.
It's
Right.
pretty straightforward, gets to the point. Chapter 2 is where things start to get a little bit more interesting. Yeah, this is a bit of a silly question, but there's this one point. Okay. Where is this? Basically, I was trying to figure out if chapter 2 is happening after the day of rest, or if this is happening, or if this is like a flashback to day 6 when he created man.
Yep. Oh, yes, the perfect question. All right, so a more conservative and literal theologian would go with that. They would say, "Oh, this is a flashback," because as you've noticed, it said that man
it kind of
was
freezes. Like the way my mind took it was like, okay, so at first I imagined like, you know, we're going through the days, he created man, awesome, cool. He's like up around and doing things, and then over here it's like, oh wait, God forgot to like give him a soul. So he has to breathe a soul into him. So it's like, okay, so what did he create man as first if he didn't have a soul? And did he just realize this after the day of rest?
Yeah. So let me give you the scholarly edition of this. And that is, again, remember that this is not taken literally. And actually, I have a quote here from, and there's a really good book. It's by Eric D. Barreto and Michael J. Chan. It's called Exploring the Bible. It is such an easy to read book, and I'll put it up on like our Instagram or whatever, but it's such an easy to read book, and it like tells you like how you should read and interpret certain things. But there's a quote from that book that says, oh, I'm sorry, that is a good book, but this quote is not from that book. This quote is from a Jewish scholar who's talking about Genesis, John D. Levinson, and he says, "The vehicle through which Genesis conveys its worldview is neither a theological tract nor a rigorous philosophical proof, nor the profession of faith. The vehicle is rather narrative. The theology must be inferred from the stories, and the lived relationship with God takes precedence over abstract theology." He later on says, "These stories are less important for the history they display than the theology they develop." So the way these stories have traditionally been read is they're like we call them myths, and that's not to say that like it's fake, it's false, burn this whole thing, Christianity needs to burn to the ground. That's a comment on genre. The genre of this is myth, and you tell myths or narrative stories to get at larger existential things. So we're developing ideas about God, and this is teaching us about who God is and whom God is, but it's not concerned with history or science. And so then to get
that should be in the preface.
Yeah, well, that you need the study Bible. You need the
maybe I'll start comparing different.
I was gonna say you
versions,
need the New Oxford Annotated Study Bible. Will get you there. But so what you just pointed to, what most scholars actually believe is that there are two creation accounts. So and I'm gonna give you I'll give you a little one way to kind of notice this. So I want you to look at chapter 2 verses 3, and just like read that verse and then read chapters 2 verse 4.
Okay, so wait, chapter 2 verse 3 and then 4.
Yeah.
Okay, and God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God had created and made.
Stop. Let's just think about that. Okay, so God had created the seventh day. He rested from all his work. Stop. Now read 4.
These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created, and in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens.
Doesn't it sound like a conclusion and then an intro?
It does. Well, the thing is, when you say it like that,
right? And remember, the Bible was not originally written in chapter and verse.
Well, and okay. I also have these headings though.
The headings will trip you up.
Yeah,
the headings are added later as well. Yeah.
Well, but this is the thing. Literally, when you say it like that, I can see it as you just framed it. But the way that my headings, there's a heading between those two verses here.
Yeah, and that's intentional, right?
So I get these are lessons for me as I continue reading.
Yeah, and it's for anyone that's reading. That is intentional to try to reconcile where the story gets different. Now, people are going to ask, well, how do you know that these are two different stories? So I'm going to give you what we see and what we believe. First of all, Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 is called the priestly account. Genesis 2:4 through through 3:24, excuse me. 2:4 through 3:24 is called the Yahwist account. And the reason that is that the belief is that the Yahwist account came first, and the Yahwist account uses a completely different word for God than the priestly account.
Okay.
And that's one indication that literarily these are written by two different authors. So the Yahwist account uses, I'm going to say this word one time, and then I'll explain why I won't say it after. They use the word Yahweh for God. Now, our Jewish friends are very particular about using that word to identify God. They believe that is the divine name. And so they don't say it outside of like very devotional text. So I try to be respectful of that. I wanted to say it so that we understood, but for future reference, I'll probably just say the divine name or Adonai or the Tetragrammaton or, some other name.
Those are all new names for me.
Yeah. And so that strictly uses the divine name. Whereas the first account uses, I believe it's Elohim, if I'm not mistaken. Is it Elohim that it uses in the first account? I think so. Either way, it's a completely, I'll have to go back and look at that. I think it's Elohim. But there's a completely different word for God. And it's not like, sometimes it uses this word. It's absolutely completely different. And then, so why is the first account called the priestly account? Because that account shows God as very orderly and doing and matches up to a lot of priestly things. I'm going to point out a few things from that first account. So in that first account,
wait, can you tell me again what's the part of the first account you were talking about?
So the first account would be 1:1 to 2:3.
Okay, gotcha.
So the world in 1:1 to 2:3 is created in a super orderly fashion.
Right.
7 days, 6 days of work. 1 day of rest, very like regal repose, looking at what I had.
And this is the priestly perspective.
Yes, God is very priestly. God is up there in the heavens doing what God does. There's this very intentional and organized symmetry. So the first 3 days, God creates domains. The second 3 days, God creates things to fill those domains. So it's what day is it? I think it's day 1 that God creates
Light.
the sky. Okay, light and darkness.
And day and night.
Day and night.
Yes.
And then day 4, God create. No, wait. Is it? I think on day 1, does God also create land and sky, like separate the land from the sky?
That's 3.
Okay, so day 3, God separates the land from the sky. On the corresponding day, I think it's day 6, he puts the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, right? The day that he creates, I think on day 1 it's light and dark, separates light and dark, and then he creates the celestial bodies, exactly, the stars, things like that. So there's a symmetry between those days.
Interesting.
The number 7 represents completeness, and again, this is something that had come to be believed much later on, which is why we think this is a later version that the priests got together and sort of composed or added onto. So check this out. Months are lunar at this time. Years are solar, but a week is not tied to any specific astrological event. So they developed the concept of 7 days off of that idea of completeness. The phrase, "and he saw that it was good," appears 7 times.
Oh.
The word God occurs 35 times. The section devoted to the 7th day has 35 words in Hebrew. So every single thing that happens in this derivative of 7.
What's the significance of 35?
It's a derivative of 7.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So it's about getting at that completeness. And the other reason they think that this is a priestly account is because the Sabbath is something that the priests talk about. It comes out in the 10 Commandments. You should take this day, you should rest this day. So imposing that into the story as the reason we should rest is because even God took a rest. Now notice how God changes in the second one. First of all,
I've well, okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Where to even go with this? And this is also based on my footnotes. Okay, so I will fully acknowledge that some of this is based on my footnotes. One of the things that they were explaining in these footnotes is that part of what God is doing is creating these promises, creating these covenants. And, I do know I don't know all of the covenants. They said there's 8, according to this. I know of some, don't know of all of them, but in this description, they say, God is testing. And that was one of the first things that, I just find problematic.
Yeah.
And I just really, it's if God is creating us in his image, man and woman, why does he need to test us? And it seems like a test destined for failure.
Yeah, literally.
That's it's okay, so it's basically a baby. I mean, I don't know if we know Adam's age or whatever, but there's no way Adam was going to ever succeed in this test. Well, I guess Eve is the one that fucked it up. We're not there yet.
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there.
But it's just this idea of setting a test. Literally the words they use. It says so this is defining dispensation, and they're talking about this is the dispensation of innocence. So it's a period of time during which man is tested in respect of obedience to some specific revelation of the will of God. I have trouble with so many of those words.
Yes.
I have trouble with the idea of being tested, the idea of obedience, and especially based on what the fuck specific revelation?
Yeah.
But especially this tested in obedience.
Yeah.
I'm already it just doesn't sit well with me.
So again, this is that is one interpretation.
Yeah.
It's not the majority view. But this is where but what is maybe not the majority view, but what is a large view? If you ask kind of the average Christian, what is it about? And it probably says it in some of your headlines in there. Okay, well, this is about God creating the first humans. God giving the first humans free will. So that's where that disobedience comes in, right? God gave them free will. They chose to sin. They were punished for their sin. And that punishment, sits with us. So it's about sin, the fall of man, and free will. The word sin never occurs in the creation story. The word free will never occurs in the creation story, right? So this idea that this story is about sin and free will and the fall of humanity is something that, again, was interpreted later and then put back in. That's why you have the headings and things like that. I was reading a book called The Sin of Certainty. I think I sent it to you guys. It's a scholar. He teaches over at Eastern, not far from here. I'm blanking on his name right now. I'll have to go back and look. Oh, Peter Entz, Dr. Peter Entz. And he was telling a story about when he was I think he went to Yale for divinity school, either Yale or Harvard. But he was talking to a Jewish friend of his, a fellow colleague, and he says the fall of man. And the Jewish colleague goes, "What's the fall of man?" And he's like, "What do you mean, what's the fall of man? Like, it's the story in Genesis. Like, this, we share this story. Like, it's in the Hebrew Bible." And they're like, "Where'd you get the idea that it's about the fall of man? It doesn't even say that, right?" And so he was shocked because his whole Christian upbringing was that this story was about the fall of man. But if you acknowledge that it never directly states sin. There is a act of disobedience, more or less, but it never directly states sin. It also never directly states the word curse is never used. So there's that ending part where like women are cursed to like to bear children painfully, and men are cursed to toil the fields.
I didn't get to that part yet.
Okay, yeah. But even that word curse in Hebrew is never actually used. So then what is the story actually about? If we're gonna go back and say, okay, these ideas were added later, or were interpreted later, or were drawn out later, is there another interpretation, or is there another way to see this? And so like going back to the Yahwist account, again, it begins with man. So already we have something different. In the first account, everything's about God and God's ability to create in this orderly fashion, right? God is very regal, God is very priestly. In the second version of this account, it begins with man. God is very centered on creating man. Man is the first creation. That's the other reason that we believe this is a different account, because everything happens in a different order. God creates man, then God creates animals. In the first account, God creates animals and God creates man. So again,
I did notice that as well. It was also there. Another like kind of little silly thing that I noticed was like, is like he recognizes like, okay, Adam's lonely.
Yeah.
So let's get him some friends.
I have a funny
okay,
story
all the animals come on in. Like
so there's a funny
and he realizes like, yeah, the animals aren't good enough. Okay, let's make you a woman.
So a really, really funny thing about that piece, if you go back into Jewish literature and theology has a really, really just dope dynamic of like creating a conversation out of everything, and like talking and like going, and like there's all kinds of Jewish literature where they'll like make stories about, like almost like fan fiction, like make stories about the stories to imagine like what would it have been like on the second day, or like whatever it is. And so a lot of scholars have pointed out that it seems that the intention of those verses was that God was literally trying to, or if God wasn't, Adam was trying to figure out what is a suitable helper. And so there's verses that allude to Adam trying to figure out who he's sexually compatible with, and realizing that he's not sexually compatible with any of the animals. And then there's Eve, and then he sees Eve, and Eve is very good. And so that's a funny little like, and
then they were both naked, and they were not ashamed.
Yes. So again, that's a funny little kind of like fan fiction addition to the thing. And I laugh thinking of Adam like picking up a cat and being like, that don't work. Like, just
I would
like
call this a cat.
Yeah. That's not that don't quite fit. But yeah. So that Yahweh's account begins with man. Man is formed from the dirt. So think about that. Right. God is manipulating the source. God doesn't do any manipulating in the first version. God just speaks everything into existence. So that perspective on God is that God speaks And it happens. Again, God is regal. God is powerful. God is king.
He is mighty and does all.
In the Yahwist account, God God manipulates the dirt. God manipulates the soil. God is anthropomorphic. Remember when Adam and Eve do eat the fruit, what does God do? He walks in the garden, right? There's this image that God has legs and arms. It says that they are image bearers of God, that they are literally made in God's image. Also, God doesn't know what they're doing. Like, think about that too. And like, now, and again, now this can be explained in different ways. Some people would say, because there's a verse, and I don't have it in front of me what the exact verse is, but essentially God says, "Where are you?" And they're hiding from him after they've eaten the fruit. And so some people go, "Oh, well, that's a rhetorical question," but that's a conclusion you arrive to after you have a presupposition, right? If you have a presupposition that God knows everything, and that God is omniscient.
I've never really thought about God in that sense, actually, or of like God is also a learner in this process,
right,
and is making errors as well, like is
so
capable of making errors.
And so because people are uncomfortable with a God that makes errors or a God that doesn't know everything, they take that and go, that must be a rhetorical question. But notice that's
like they
not
try to justify it rather than
right. And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I'm simply saying notice that is not the text does not explicitly state one way or another. It just simply says that God was looking for them. So it seems that the God that is talked about in the second version, the second account, is actually isn't quite all knowing, clearly more knowing and more powerful, but isn't quite all knowing either, or that just wasn't a concern of the authors of this particular text. So you really do get two different. You get a God that is walking with us, talking with us, that is relational, that cares about what we're doing and where we're going, and that is kind of on earth with us, moving with us, anthropomorphic, and you get the regal, perfect God. It's that there are a lot of people that want those to be two different perspectives on the same God, but that might be a little bit presumptuous. It really may be two different opinions about God.
Well, and I think that actually leads into kind of like my biggest question from this is it comes down to this rule that's being established.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think this context that you laid out is helpful for me in processing it, but I am curious to hear you speak a little bit more possibly about, why create this rule of you don't want, or like, I guess maybe even some of the symbolism of like this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, if that's what it was. So like we have this tree representing knowledge, good of evil. As a teacher, I would like to think these are good things that people should know about.
Yeah.
Like people should want to know about this. Why are you setting a limitation and why are you setting a restriction for these humans that you just made to not do?
That's a good question. First, I think I made a mistake, and I just want to make sure, because on this podcast we acknowledge our mistakes. So it's the priestly account, and then it's the Elohist account, because it's the second account that uses Elohim, and it's the first account that uses the divine name. Okay. So I think I swapped that earlier. It was running in my head, and I had to go to some footnotes real quick to make sure I said that right. So just in case anyone was, I'm sure the people listening that are like, we didn't give a fuck about that in the first place. Like,
nerd.
Yeah, right, nerd. But just for the sake of not being completely wrong,
yeah.
But so yeah, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Can you put some ice in my cup, by the way?
Of course.
I'm a little dry over here. So the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So again, and this is where the free will concept starts to come in and things like that. And a lot of people have asked this question, and I remember asking this question of my mom. And I have you know this, but I have a similar background to you in that my mother also passed about 5 years ago. Tragically. And she is definitely the antecedent of my faith as well. She was very faithful. She was a minister, the whole 9 yards. But for as religious and conservative and hardcore as my mom was, she never cared about questions. Like she never got angry if I asked questions. And I remember asking like, well, why God put the tree in the garden in the first place if he knew that's what we were going to do? And I remember like her being so frustrated that I was asking these questions. So like, why create evil, right? We call it the problem of evil. And so the traditional or the more conservative, I guess, answer to that is like, well, there has to be free will. You have to choose God. If God creates us and we don't have free will, we're just robots and we just do whatever we want. And so there has to be a choice. The sort of clap back to that is that if God is all powerful and can do anything, then surely God can create human beings that can choose him and not also have to have these like choices in their face that they will inevitably fail at. The other sort of clapback is, well, then does God know everything? Because if God knows that you're going to choose evil, then you don't really have free will. So then there's this sort of like, kind of, you see people trying to reconcile this idea of like, well, like I heard someone say like, oh, well, it's like if you watch a football game that you previously taped, you know what's going to happen, but you're not controlling what's happening on the field, which is a really clever analogy. But it kind of falls apart when you think about it because we're not a football game that God taped.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
those football, like I can't control those football players. I didn't like if we're going with that analogy, that means God created the game, created the players, put them on the field, and then let them go. You know what I mean? It starts to fall apart a little bit. I think where another way to sort of flip this and look at this a little bit differently. And again, I said earlier, the word free will isn't really used. So when we look at that idea of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, something that's not always brought up is that there was that in ancient Near East literature, this idea of a spectrum and sort of naming two parts of the spectrum was very common in these types of stories. So the tree of knowledge of good and evil is not knowing right from wrong. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is just the tree of knowledge. And so what you should see when you see knowledge of good and evil is good, evil, and everything in between. It's
Okay.
the idea of them gaining
But
knowledge.
why would God not want them to want that? Like, why is he creating a limitation for that?
So two comments on that. One is the idea of them gaining knowledge or getting the knowledge from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and God not wanting them to have that goes back to an idea of humans becoming too much like God. And this is a theme that is not as well talked about in the church, but we talked about it a lot in the academy. So if you go back to ancient Near East literature, and there's other creation stories that came out, even before, that predate the Bible, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I'm probably pronouncing this all wrong, but there's the Babylonian epic, the Enuma Elish, and there's always been this idea of what if man tries to become God, or tries to become like God, or tries to step out of our place as humans and take on the role of God. So the fear of humans getting the knowledge of God is that that's not our place. So this story comments on this idea. And think about it. There's one other tree that's mentioned in the garden. What's that other tree?
Oh, I did write this down.
Quiz time.
Let's see. We had 3 trees. I literally did write this down. Tree of life.
Right. So if you're inferring, what does the tree of life probably give you if you eat from it?
Life.
Eternal life, right? So the idea is like, you're not supposed to if you become immortal and you know everything, you become God. And so God's fear in the story is that humans would become gods, and that's not something that we were made for or can handle, right? And you can apply that in real world situations, right? You look at like, the death penalty is a great example. Like, is that man trying to be God, deciding when one's life should end, right? That like, is that a decision that man should be making, or that humankind should make? You could throw abortion in the same thing, right? How do these decisions get made? Is that a medical decision, right? All of these kinds of things. So that's part of that explanation, is that's it. The other one, and we haven't gotten to this part yet, is that if we take out the free will, sin, all the other things that aren't really named, this just becomes a coming of age tale. This becomes a story where God creates humans. Those humans are innocent, just like children are, right? They don't know any
Yeah, well,
better.
that's
They
part
don't
of what I
know
was thinking
anything.
when I read this. Of like, how can you like if you put someone who has no experience, like a
Hmm.
toddler,
Right.
into this and say, "Don't do this." What are they gonna do? Exactly what you told them not to do.
So and think about this. What happens in life as we come of age? We gain knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So that idea figuratively of taking the fruit and eating it is that growing into knowledge. So why do they see themselves and become ashamed? Well, little kids run around naked all the time, right? They don't know any better. They don't know anything. When you grow up, you start to understand things. You start to feel shame. You start to feel different. You start to judge things, right? So is it that God is scared for them to have knowledge, or is trying to limit knowledge? Or is it God saying, when you come to knowledge, these things will happen? And that's where we get to the end of the story, where there's like these curses or whatever. And it's like, oh, the curse, people will say, is that because Eve ate of the tree, that she has pain in childbirth. Is it a curse, or is that just, and early Jewish scholars have pointed this out, that's just the result of the knowledge. That's just a result of coming of age. All the good things in life come with suffering and come with pain, right? So when you're a kid, you just know that there's other kids in the world. When you get older, you know that there's a suffering that comes with having a kid in your body, and you know, growing a fetus and having to go through childbirth. Adam is cursed to toil in the fields. Well, if we stop using the word cursed and we just think of it as you, when you're a kid, what do you know? I get food, I get things that I need from the earth. You don't realize that there's work that goes into it. So it's also a commentary on the nature of humanity, that as we grow and as we gain knowledge, suffering becomes a part of it. And this is the thing that I think, that I know we got to wrap up, but so this is probably a good place to start to like tie things together. This is the interpretation of the story. And again, like, there's a lot of ways to interpret the story, and everybody sort of has a different take, and I won't make comments on what's right or wrong, but this particular idea that this story really comments on on human nature and how humans come of age and how suffering enters into our life inevitably, right? Again, not as a curse, as just an inevitability of growing old and of getting older and of gaining natural knowledge, of just understanding the world. There will be suffering. And why block them out of the garden so they can't get to the tree of life? Because it's a part of our human condition that we will die. And that's not something that's talked about when we talk about this story. I've never heard a pastor go, hey, we're talking about the creation story, and this really gets at what it means to be mortal and what it means to be human. And I just want to say to everybody here, you will die. Memento mori, you will die. And then just let everybody sit in that and just say, hey, we got prayer ministers over here if you want to talk about it, or you want someone to pray with you. But I just want you to sit back and contemplate that. Like, we don't like to think about our mortality and our suffering. And that's the part of the story that, if you're not trying to read it literally and you're not trying to make all the pieces fit together and ignore that there might be two separate stories and everything like that, that's what you miss when you do all of that stuff. But if you take this as literature, and you try to say, okay, what is this literature telling me about the nature of life, the existential nature of things, and the nature of God, you can start to have a conversation about suffering. You can start to have a conversation about mortality. You can start to have a conversation about death. And you're getting into things that are hard to talk about and are difficult, but are probably more fruitful. And so if there's anything that I would say to people at home, people that are listening, when they're reading, this story specifically, is to look for those things. Like, and I think it's a good thing to do when you read the Bible anyway. Like, whatever you were trained with or brought up with, like, set that to the side and just think a little bit more about what may or may not be happening. Get yourself a good Bible, get yourself a good commentary, if you need to. But it's really important, because that's a deep thing that I don't think we're comfortable talking about. But I told you about that theologian I'm studying now. She talks about, like, God being most present in the suffering. And think about that chapter 2 version of God, that anthropomorphic God that sits with you and walks with you in the garden. Like, that's the version of God that's there when you're suffering. Notice that it doesn't take the suffering away, but that God is there with you. And God isn't inflicting you with the suffering. It's just a part of your humanity.
Well, and I I can add some personal reflections with that. So like, I mentioned, I grew up in the Episcopal Church. I've been resistant to a lot, or I've been resistant to religion a lot in my life. But when my father passed, it really was the time that it's odd because I had so much anger.
Yeah.
And just like, fuck you, why did this happen?
Right.
But at the same time, so many parts of my life fell into place.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
there was some purpose there.
Yeah, or it's, I lost a little bit of my words there, but the connection that you're making between suffering and life and death and the presence of God, because I think so many people, it's easy to say like there's all of these horrible things happening, where is God? Like, why would God make my father just have a heart attack one night?
Right.
Like, there's no just God if that is what happens.
Right.
But that event did lead me on a series of paths, like, where I am very happy today. And I still, it still isn't 100% my thing.
Right. Right.
I still don't, 100% buy into it, but I actually do think within my own suffering is when I have had the strongest desire to have this kind of like existential power make more sense.
Yeah. And it's
and I didn't even think about that at all within these first 2 chapters until you made some of these connections, but it makes sense and I see it. And
I think that's an important part of the story. When my mother passed, I was always Christian, but I had to really, and I knew what the answers were supposed to be, right? Everything happens for a reason, and this God will use this for your glory, or what all of the kind of things we tell people. But what I eventually had to do is sit with the fact that everyone's going to die.
Yeah.
We will experience this. We will experience suffering. We will experience pain, and it's okay. And maybe God isn't up in heaven doing these things to me and making my mom die and going up there and saying, "Oh, wouldn't it be cool? I'm going to make Donte's mom die just to teach him lessons." Maybe this is a part of the mortal existence, the human condition. And instead of God being in heaven, he's right here. He, she, they is in the room, is in our midst at all times, where 2 or 3 are gathered. And the purpose of the suffering, not even that suffering has to have a purpose. Suffering just is. It happens. It's a part of who we are. And we use those moments to turn to God. And when I say turn to God, I don't mean you fall down on your knees and you pray and you praise God and you do all these things. I mean, you yell at God, you scream at God, you curse at God. You say, "I can't fucking believe you did this." But then you come back the next day. That's what Job did. That's what Ruth did, right? That's what so many people did. And so if there's any like parting piece of this, and I know it's almost like a sad note to end on, but like but I think it's real.
Also appropriate.
And it's real. Yeah. Like look at that Genesis 2:4 to 3:24 version of God, that anthropomorphic, that God that's there with you, and sit in your suffering and be okay with it and find the God in it. I would challenge anyone out there, anyone listening, whatever you're going through, whatever thing is hard, whatever thing is difficult, find the God in it. Find the God in the suffering. Find the God in the pain. And that's something that can be pulled out of the scripture. And you may not have heard it that way because it doesn't get people up and clapping and jumping up for joy, but it's a part of the story, and it's an important one. But I know we're going to get kicked out of the studio at some point. So, we'll be back. Let us know, like us on Instagram and comment. Let us know how you felt about the episode. The plan is to talk Cain and Abel next time. So that's another fun story. And so we're going to keep doing this and keep jumping back in. So, please join us, pour a drink of your own, or whatever it is that you like to do, and
read
just
along
sit back,
before
read
next time.
Yeah, read along before. Oh, I should have had the Cain and Abel verses. I'll put it on the Instagram. Just join us so that we can keep having these dope conversations. So, cheers.
Ching ching.
All right, we'll see you guys next time.